Thank you, Mark, for coming on the show. Explain to us why you think it's impossible for the world to make an energy transition, even if it's not a complete one, away from hydrocarbon and towards clean energy. Why can't the world do this?
Well, it's a timing problem, and it's a physics problem. The data show, and this is not a political opinion, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with the motivations for why people are promoting an energy transition. One just has to look at the facts. The fact is, after at least $5 trillion of spending globally on non-hydrocarbons, the world has only reduced its dependence on hydrocarbons by 2 percentage points for the last 20 years. It's just in the data. And the absolute consumption of hydrocarbons, all three, oil, gas, and coal, have increased since then. Or let me put it differently. If you look at the total supply of energy to the world from wind and solar, which are the primary vectors of the ambitions for the transition, the total supply of wind and solar to the world's energy systems is barely approaching 4 percentage points now. This is not a transition that's happening quickly. And frankly, it's not a transition. We have a nomenclature problem. Over history, what happens is when new ways of producing energy that society needs come along in ways that are useful and affordable, they add to, they don't fully replace what was already there. In fact, the world still gets more than twice as much energy, amazingly, from burning wood today than from all the world's solar panels combined. And I would suggest that wood is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, energy source in humanity's use.
Mark, I think it's important for you to make a disclosure here to our viewers. Are you a climate change denier?
Don't you love these invectives and words in science? They have no meaning and no place in science, by the way. This is a debate that's been going on for centuries, not just decades. I want to make it clear that what I write about and what my reports are about have nothing whatsoever to do with what you believe about the severity, the velocity, or the veracity of the climate science debate. I write about the energy sciences, the energy technology field. These are independent domains. It doesn't matter what you think about gravity. Know that building an airplane requires following the laws of physics and aerodynamics, the engineering that's possible. So all of my analyses are basically about answering this question. If you are trying to push and accelerate a shift away from one form of energy to another, you should know what the consequences are, the environmental consequences, the social consequences, the geopolitical consequences, and the economic consequences. This is poorly understood, and it's poorly explained in public space, but it is extremely well understood in the science domains. The energy science is not a mystery, and it's not, in fact, debatable. So there's no sort of denying reality when it comes to what you can and cannot do with the sun and wind and with batteries.
Mark, if a transition is an impossibility, as you say, how would you suggest the world tackle the debacle of keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century then?
So again, words, as they say, matter. The transition is impossible as it's imagined and proposed in the timeframes that are being suggested or mandated. It's not happening at those scales, and it won't happen at those scales. And that's locked into the sort of engineering, economics, and physics of energy systems, not aspirations, excuse me. And it's not a money issue. It's a practical issue in the domains of energy. So we have to ask the question of what is possible as opposed to what our aspirations are. And of course, in the possibilities of things, there are many ways we can produce energy. Energy is an infinite supply in the universe we live in. We're always finding new ways and new technologies and even new physics. The problem is it takes time to find new science, a long time. You have to fund science. You don't subsidize. Let me put it very simplistically. Subsidizing yesterday's technologies from science that we know does not create new science or future technologies. So solutions to reducing hydrocarbon use will come from essentially more efficiency in using hydrocarbons. That's how we'll use less of it. And from finding fundamentally new ways to supply energy to society that are sort of phenomenologically different from what we're doing today. That won't happen quickly. that won't happen easily, but it almost certainly will happen. Again, timing matters. We didn't get to where we are in the energy systems of the world overnight. It took much more than a century.
But don't you think that if what is termed today as Green New Deals are adopted more widely, the world is capable of quickly mobilizing societies, economies, and resources in such a scale that can achieve ambitious renewables and climate goals while at the same time unleashing an economic growth revolution?
Right. Well, again, this is a common way to look at it in the political world, but mobilizing, and these are, of course, terms that come out of warfare, typically. Society is capable of mobilizing for short time frames things that are profoundly uneconomic and not sustainable in any real way. Wars, we mobilize for wars. We consume vast quantities of society's money and time to mobilize for war, and we do it for a short time period, and then we demobilize because societies can't afford mobilization 24/7, 365 days a year for decades. So the analogy is actually kind of useful. And the fact that those who have ambitions to, quote, mobilize to push more green energy, more wind and solar again, primarily, and more hydrogen now, it's become the energy source du jour. That phraseology should tell you something. It's a mobilization at massive economic scales, and it's economically destructive. We've seen the evidence of that already. The effect of the kind of X-ray that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has shown how economically and strategically ineffective the mobilization of windmills and solar panels has been for Europe. And Europe has spent arguably $1 trillion plus building wind and solar, and just to discover they were only able to do that, and many of us who have analyzed this over the years knew it, on the back of using cheap Russian imports of both natural gas, oil, and frankly also coal. So it's a dangerous policy. In fact, the reason I call in my report, I call it a delusion, a dangerous delusion, is that we're seeing the evidence of how dangerous it is to implement energy policies at society scale. They're not achievable or affordable in the timeframes that are meaningful for keeping people safe and healthy and the economy's growing.
Let's talk about the affordability. Has the world entered an inflection point where high energy prices are the new normal for the medium term, no matter what direction the energy transition takes at this juncture?
I fear the answer is yes, it's probably yes. And this is a consequence of policies again. Governments are capable of implementing policies that are either counterfactual or counterproductive or both. The underinvestment in global oil and gas production, which began well before the war is exposed in Ukraine, this underinvestment is going on for almost a decade in exploration and production of future oil and gas supplies. That bears fruit. It bears negative fruit. It leads to higher prices. Not overnight, in the sense that price volatility always comes into play because of economic cycles. But over the coming 5 years or so, it's going to be very, very hard to meet global oil demands, no matter how much governments push alternatives to oil. This won't cause wind and solar and electric vehicles to get cheaper. In fact, it will cause them to become more expensive because all of the hydrocarbon machines that are needed to make the green machines become more expensive. It's the opposite of what you would call a virtuous circle. It's a negative cycle to create higher costs and higher prices. And it'll be accelerated by the fact that the green machines require fundamentally astonishing increases in the quantities of minerals that have to be mined. Not unusual minerals like the rare earths neodymium, that too, but common minerals like copper and nickel. The demands for copper and nickel for the green aspirations are 1,000% to 5,000% beyond the world's existing or planned mining capacities. This is profoundly inflationary for the entire economy. I don't think it's sustainable. I think it will end, and it won't end because of any policies. It will end because governments and economies won't be able to tolerate the economic impacts.
Let's turn to the geopolitical aspects, turning back to the Ukraine crisis in particular. In your opinion, who is, at least for the moment, winning the energy war? Is it the EU or is it Putin?
Well, it's the energy war. I mean, we're fighting, there's sort of three wars going on, obviously. There's the hot war on the battlefield, which is horrific, causing serious loss of life and destruction of property. And there's a geopolitical war, if you like, a political war. And then there's also the energy war. It's not a matter of who's winning, in a sense, it's who's losing. Both parties are losing the energy war. It will damage Russia in the long term. Right now, Russia has greater, not fewer, dollar receipts from sale of oil and gas and coal to world markets because of escalated prices. The fuels, in large measure, are still flowing into the world market. Europe is losing the energy war. And I could say this, we can just look at the data. Whether it ultimately loses it in the end, we'll see how its policies change. But at the moment, it would not be an exaggeration to say that Europe, not Russia, is deindustrializing. The impact of restricted supplies and extremely high prices, given the nature of the energy system Europe deliberately designed, is causing fertilizer plants, metal refineries, steel mills, all manner of industries across Europe to shut down. Whether they reopen, in fact, we know 80% of the fertilizer plants in Europe are shut down. I believe about half of the metal refineries have shut down. If this sustains itself, even at a significant level, I mean a minor level rather, it will be profoundly destructive to the European economy. So Europe is in danger of being deindustrialized faster than Russia. So at the moment, Europe is losing that particular war. And as I said, whether they win or not will depend on whether they adopt policies that recognize the physics and economic realities of energy systems. And this won't be because they'll surge more windmills. They'll do that too. It'll be because they'll surge the use of more natural gas, more oil refineries elsewhere, different locations of pipelines, and LNG import terminals, which they're now building finally, after all these years of debate of whether they should or shouldn't.
Do you see a possible outcome where the West will actually be able to eventually ostracize Russian energy, which amounts to almost 10% of global supplies of hydrocarbons today?
So the answer is sure, yes. On the first part of your question, the West can ostracize a country. The West ostracized South Africa over apartheid, as you know. The West is still ostracizing Iran. In North Korea. I mean, the West can do that. And it can have an economic impact on the countries that are ostracized. But when it comes to energy and the energy minerals, things like copper and nickel that flow into the world's economy, the impacts are not what everybody would hope or expect. That is, the energy and minerals, I think, will continue to flow into the world markets, as they have from other ostracized countries. Markets will be found for the products at a discount, either legally at a discount or being purchased by nations that are not party to the ostracization, to the sanctions, or illicitly or illegally or secretly. This is what happens in the real world on products that matter to the world. And it does matter, to your point, that Russia's share of world energy supply at 10% is an extraordinarily important percentage. It seems like a small number, but that's roughly the percentage share of world energy that Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Russia each have on world markets, roughly 10% of world's energy production. Russia, however, is a far bigger exporter than the United States. The United States avoids being a big importer, by virtue of being a big producer. The impact of Russian sanctions, or, which I think is underappreciated, the possibility of Russia embargoing the West itself, imposing a ban on the exports of oil and gas outright, not just to Europe, to punish world markets, would be extraordinarily consequential in both price terms and inflationary terms. And I think a lot of planners are naive to rule out the possibility that Russia will lash out and decide that enough damage, enough economic damage has been put on their nation, and they'll want to impose it on the nations that are doing that to them. These are high consequence games for a region, as you again point out, that is a very significant share of world's critical energy supply. Again, to close on this point, 10% of world energy, that's oil and gas and coal. You know, the world gets 84% of all of its energy, so rather 82% of all of its energy from oil, gas, and coal today, just a couple of percentage points down from 20 years ago. These are consequential decisions. They affect everybody in the world. They affect food all over the world. They affect the production of everything. And again, they affect the production of the green machines themselves.
Mark, my last question to you. Can then the United States be the sole winner of the energy war that we see today?
Well, I could answer that with one word, too. No, it will not be the sole winner. And in fact, I would say energy wars are bad for everybody, even the so-called winners. And this is also true of energy wars. This is not a good thing to be doing. I'm talking about not the Russian invasion of Ukraine per se, but the energy war that is precipitating. It has high consequence. But in a sort of broad, cynical way, sure, the countries that are producers of oil and gas and coal, which, by the way, many Asian nations, and I put at the top of the list China, the countries that are producers of hydrocarbons, each and all of them, are winners in the sense in a world that has made a deliberate decision to underproduce the critical fuels for the world. So the suppliers will, again, cynically, enjoy higher prices. But the oil and gas world is an odd world, in my experience. It's one of the few that I work in, and I work in a lot of industries, particularly the technology industry, where the executives in those industries will publicly say and work hard towards a future that has cheaper energy. You'd think that they would just sit back and be quiet and happy at high prices because profits go up. But they recognize how critical these fuels are to the world's economy and to the world's poor. And they understand that a sustainable future is a healthy future in economic terms. And keeping society healthy means cheap energy. So they actually believe, what I believe, that proper energy plans and policies would direct the world towards cheaper energy. So the winners become consumers, and you still make a profit as an oil, gas, and even coal producer. But war profits are ill-gotten profits. There will be winners. There already are winners in war profits. And it's not because of anything that's been done. It's not profiteering by the producers. It's actually a decision by the consuming nations, their governments, to do things that cause this to happen. We would not have had this massive price spike in oil and gas if your energy system were structured the same way it was 30 years ago, which is highly resilient and primarily hydrocarbon dependent.
Yeah. Mark Mills, thank you very much for taking the time and coming on the show.
Thank you.